So now, segueing into the last session of the day, which is a panel discussion, and we'll be starting in like about 2 minutes now. For those who don't know me, my name is Vaibhav Chaudhary. I'm the new visiting professor of practice at the Department of Sustainable Energy and Engineering, SEE, here at IITK. I'll be co-chairing this panel along with my colleague, Dr. Maushumi, who comes from the Department of IME. Dr. Maushumi, if you can please come on stage. The format will be very simple. I mean, it will be as interactive, as discussion-oriented as possible. This is what we would like to do. And hopefully we would aim to get some action points towards the end of the session. And we'll also give time for Q&As for the participants who are sitting there in the room. So I will encourage you to sort of jot down questions if you have any. So we'll come back to you towards the end of the session, maybe about 60 minutes from now. And please come forward, guys, if you like to. So the format would be that my colleague Maushumi will be setting the context in next few minutes. And after we set the context, we'll call each one of our fellow panelists, very ambient sort of speakers and experts in the subject of carbon finance, decarbonization, future pathways for net zero. We would be asking them to sort of give their opening remarks or comments for like a couple of minutes. After that, we'll follow the discussion into like a moderated session. And at the end, we'll open it up for everyone to ask questions and answers. So to start, let me call upon the panel at the podium on the stage. The first panelist I would like to call upon is Dr. Nitin Pant. Dr. Nitin Pant had already been, we've already briefed him about Nitin Pandit. We've already shared his bio with everyone, so I'll be very brief. So Dr. Pandit was a former director at WRI in Athri, and we are so honored to have you here, sir. The next panel on stage, I would like to call upon Dr. S.N. Tripathi. Dr. S.N. Tripathi is a very well-known air pollution expert in the country and around the world. He is also a very eminent professor at IIT Kanpur here. So Dr. Tripathi, welcome. The next panel I would like to call upon is Shri Anil Srivastava. Shri Anil Srivastava is also an alumni of IIT Kanpur and a new professor of practice at the Department of SEE. Along with that, he's been a former civil servant. He's come from the IES in the Government of India. He has an extensive experience in civil aviation, electric vehicles, battery storage, transformative mobility, public management, global negotiations, monitoring and evaluation in government, most recently in the capacity as an advisor and secretary equivalent in the Niti Aayog. Welcome, Mr. Srivastava. The next panel on stage, I would like to call upon Mr. Amitabh Sinha. Mr. Amitabh Sinha had been here before, so I'll not read his entire bio, but Mr. Sinha works for the Indian Express and is partly shuffled between Delhi and Pune. Welcome once again. Alex, we have had the opportunity to interact at length with Alex, so we have let him go. The next panel I would like to call upon is Swapnil Joshi. Swapnil is here. Swapnil Joshi is with the Smart Space and Sustainability Center of Excellence at the Infosys, and he leads the Smart Buildings practice there. Swapnil leads various aspects of building sustainability and has delivered infrastructure to the highest standards of green at the Infosys campus. Welcome, Swapnil. And the last panelist I would like to call upon is Dr. Shirish Sinha. Dr. Shirish Sinha, again, I will not go through the whole resume because you've been here on the panel and this is previous to the one session we had before lunch. So Dr. Sinha, very briefly, he's a director at this UK-based philanthropy called the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. He has more than 20 years of experience working in the developing sector, mostly looking at energy and climate challenges around India and the Southeast Asia region. Now over to you, Maushumi, to just set the context, and after that we'll open up for the panelists to give a 2-3 minute sort of opening remarks, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I welcome you you all. To the student communities, I think you should really occupy the first few rows. Just the fact that we have the experts here and we are not letting them go. So, you put really hard and tough questions to them. And yeah, I think this conversation is very, very timely, right? Look at what is happening to energy dialogues and the way it is shaping our relations, both national as well as international, right? And to give a context of India's own journey with energy, right? We have been listening how important it is for India in its own self-interest to make this transition. Right? Currently, we have around 80% of our energy needs met through fossils, that lot. Right? 55% of coal and about 30% of oil. And if you look at it, we are importing a large chunk of this from abroad. In 2019, I think we have spent $150 billion on just energy imports. So in a way, we are paying to, for our emissions, while other countries are paying to reduce their emissions. So that itself is a very, very big challenge. And then going forward, right, we saw that by 2040, it is expected that our energy demand will somewhere increase by 1.5 to 1.7 times of what we are consuming today. And remember that our electricity consumption alone in that scenario is expected to grow by 2.5 times. That's not really a small number. What we are staring at is substituting our current energy use base as well as making sure that we have enough energy to meet our new demand. And that complicates the challenge a bit. And few of the challenges that we saw is in form of what happens to the communities and the states that are so reliant on fossils. Right? Pradeep's work and what my ex-colleague worked on, coal, that sector alone has an employment of 1.5 to 2 million. Right? That's not a small number. Australia is dealing with 20,000 job losses in coal, and they have been having continuous discussion around it. So it's a very, very serious transition that we are looking at, and I have still not come to the finance part of it. It is expected that India needs somewhere close to $170 billion each year as against this. In 2019, we just had $44 billion. That's 1/4 of what we really need. So you see the big gap in finance, the big, big challenge of transitioning, and with all this geopolitics of what energy is taking us into, I give the tougher questions to our experts here, and I will invite them to share, their perspective of what net zero transition looks like for India.
Yeah, and maybe like if you can add in your 2-3 minutes of deliberation as an opening remark, what are those 1 or 2 things from maybe the donor side or being a private sector participant side or from the media side, what are those 1 or 2 top action points do you think that as a stakeholder, important stakeholder you think that? So we can start maybe from Shirish.
Yeah, and just before we do that, I would also like to call upon Anup here as a panel expert, because really the discussion on net zero will not happen without power sector into the picture. Right, that is the big wheel here. So Anup, can you please join us? Anup is a professor. So he is professor at IIB department and is also the coordinator for the Center Energy Regulation Center and Energy Analytics Lab.
I have a 5 o'clock lecture.
We will put some questions before you leave.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Anup, let's start with you then.
That's not
Because you said that you're leaving.
Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, I mean the basic, the first question is how do you see India's power sector transitioning up until 2030 and then up until 2050? And in particular, where do you see the role of coal and nuclear into that picture?
Okay, so let me address nuclear first.
I hope the mic is on. I hope it's audible, right?
No, it's not on, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, it's on. So let me first address nuclear, which is relatively easier at least to answer. We have around, I think, 6,700 megawatt, not even 1.7% of the total capacity. Nuclear is a different characteristic, it's a strategic nature. So you want nuclear just not because it's a energy security as of now, you also need it because for a variety of other purposes, which as a nation probably we need to accept and we have to move on. In fact, I recall we were discussing yesterday, it was Srivastava, long back we did a study which was funded by SIDA, and we had in our, the capacity projection plan, and the nuclear was appearing, so they were upset that why it is there. I said, what can we do? It is there. It's likely to be there. The only question is that whether it's going to grow fast, not likely. I think given the fact that we had already more or less all the agreements in place, still things are not moving the way it should have moved. So it's a international geopolitics, it will probably stay there. If we are able to master the thorium cycle, and then probably world will start looking at us, that's our game changer if it happens. From the coal perspective, from power sector perspective, the only thing I'll add is a lot of discussion has happened, so I'll be quick about what has probably not been there. Remember, we are all, I think somebody did mention, we are all looking at demand as of it is now. A lot of power sector demand is going to emerge, which we never witnessed earlier. So it's electric vehicles and green hydrogen. So green hydrogen was never in the picture, so a lot of our green hydrogen initially is going to be exported. So we will actually need much more renewable just because of green hydrogen itself. Because currently we are discussing the green hydrogen standards, which are being discussed still at the MNRE level. The definition that gate to gate that is being adopted is beyond certain cutoff. It should be called green hydrogen, but it has to come from the green. So that will essentially change the ball game for the sector as a whole. Even if we might say to some extent that we don't want, coal might be there. So the base coal will still remain, more capacity may not be added. But there is another reason now more renewable will be added, and it may be added even with storage even battery. But if it happens, I think it is okay because they are going to justify it based on the economic value of green hydrogen in the international market. If those projects are able to justify it, then we have to piggyback on that as a power sector. If that becomes very cheaper because it's domestically going to be manufactured, well, then we are probably in for the battery at that point of time. But coal is likely to stay for some time, as we have looked at. Anywhere close to 100 gigawatt, below that, at least it's not visible. So 100% RE is it possible? We already have, in the market now, what is called RE-RTC contracts. This means you over-design the system, both the capacity as well as the power electronics, and now there are actual contracts which are being there in the market, which means RE-RTC is becoming feasible. So states are actually looking at. So now the risk of that chunk that they are providing you as a base sort of supply, it's all with the investors, and if they are able to do it, it's fine. But if you call whether the state utilities will start doing it, there it becomes much more of a question of really economic judgment then.
Sure. Yeah. Can we now go to Shirish? Maybe you can start from here on your opening remarks.
Thank you so much. I was listed last, so I was hoping I would come last. No, I think on the question of the net zero and the transition, as you're looking at, we really brought all the key issues that are essentially needed from the transition point of view. Now, from our perspective, the way we are looking at it, in a program areas of funding that we support, and we basically support think tank partners and Jay's working essentially on air pollution. So where we really see, one, in terms of the net zero goal, 2070, there was a lot of pressure, and India essentially now announced it. What India has also talked about is an enhanced targets for 2030, which India had earlier committed to 2015, and now further been increased or enhanced with the Prime Minister made. And now it's also been noted as part of India's UNFCCC submission, right? So there are clearly more ambitious targets which India has put for itself. And I agree with that when he was saying the government needs to put certain ambitious targets. It allows market conditions to happen. What we are basically there to see, how is that going to be achieved, right? One is national level commitments and targets that the government can announce because it is also linked to their international commitments. But domestically, if you have to really achieve that, what is the approach to it? And that's where our emphasis is now being that while we need to focus on each of these sectors which are needed for India's energy transition to happen, where those sectors come together is at a subnational level. So it is at the level of the states, or it is at the level of the cities, or level of the ground panchayats, which Mr. Tiwari was talking, right? UP is the first state is actually talking about making gram panchayats more climate smart, not resilient. Resilience has been an approach that has been taken so far, but it's a climate smart gram panchayat. Which means, and the reason to do it is that this is how the fund flows happen for program implementation. At panchayat level funds comes, at city level funds are available. So if you want to really make impact through the program for implementation to happen, this is the approach. So that's our way of thinking right now, that each of India's commitments can be fulfilled, overachieved, exceeded before 2030 or at some time frame. Right? But for that to happen, implementation support has to be there, and that implementation happens at the state level or at the city level. So if the set of points that co-benefits that Navroz was talking about, livable cities, right? It's talking about integration of several sectoral action that needs to happen there. And it's possible to implement at that stage. And that's the fundamental approach that we're taking now, that in the different sectors, solutions are available and the policies, regulation that is needed, but approach it through a sub-national lens. So that's the, and we strongly believe that that's a way approach to look at, to follow for the net zero pathway that India has set for it to be essentially achieved.
Great, thank you. Over to you, Swapnil. On the role of private sector, how you can sort of build the templates around for other private sector colleagues to learn from your experience being in it.
Yeah, so thank you, Shirish, for setting up the context very well and bringing in the element of implementation. Right. Today I was a bit conflicted because I was not really sure that whether I was in a discussion that we were focusing on sustainability as a whole, net zero as a whole, or just an energy discussion. And then I promised to myself that I would refuse to get influenced by only the energy discussions that are happening. Right? And I have data and we have experience implementing a lot of these strategies within our campuses and campuses, that 50% of the world's wicked sustainability problems can be solved using existing technology today. And if we are in a position to look at what these technologies are, look at how they can be implemented and implemented in the right spirit, we would be in a position to achieve or be a carbon neutral company as Infosys is. And I'm going to talk more on what are the value realization models and dashboards that we have created. Not only taking into account the energy aspect of it, but also looking at emissions, water, waste, and of course the human capital aspect of it. More during the next few minutes.
Just a couple of things. First on nuclear, because this has come up earlier also and now. So for the first time, I have heard in the last 6 months from multiple people that the nuclear getting opened for private sector is not a huge blockage. Not that it is happening anytime soon, it will be a big decision. But the fact that, it has even come up, or people have even started talking about it, about the possibility of being opened up, probably signals a change in what might be happening in policy circles. So I don't think it's happening anytime soon. But maybe, and not just the private sector, maybe the first step would be to let agencies like NTPC, for example, or GAIL or ONGC, try to ease into the nuclear sector as well. So that might be a possibility that people have discussed, and in all these years, probably I'm hearing it for the first time. So maybe there is some discussion happening there on that.
Just to quickly add, there was actually the sticky point was about the liability clause.
Yeah.
The cap and
of course. So that will have to be fixed in any case.
Your remarks.
Well, last 2 days have been overexposure to the energy issues and net zero and all that. So it's kind of what to say. I firmly believe that if anything has to succeed in a society or in a country, then everybody has to be involved, and it has to be kind of everybody's participation. It has to be a mass movement, whether it is net zero, and then everybody sitting around in the country, the entire population has to understand as to why net zero. This is a very fundamental question. Sitting here in these academic institutions, probably we have to, and this probably I would urge upon to all the students' body sitting here or students sitting here, that we must think, we must question as to why is it that what we are doing and what is our relevance to the society or to the public at large and what we are doing. That is very critical for this entire discussion and the center for which we are here, that is energy policy, and energy policy for whom, likewise. So this is something very fundamental. Those are the issues which come to my mind as after 2 days of the deliberations which I have seen. Now, second point which comes to my mind is that we generally tend to forget, and particularly when we are overemphasizing on the technology or the technical issues, we forget that these are the market forces which decide the final outcome as to what is going to happen in the society or in a larger segment. Now, the market forces will decide as to whether the coal is going to be there or how much of the renewable energy is going to be adopted, unless, now the role of the technology is that how to influence that market, those market forces, how to introduce something in the market so that that is easily adopted. So this is something which also comes to my mind as to the general environment, the acceptability of the technology, the acceptability of the issues by the public at large, by the masses at large, and then the circumstances or the environment or the ecosystem which will be created for almost all the stakeholders by the market forces or the ecosystem, so that it gets adopted. So these are the certain things which are there. There are certain assumptions which we start following, like, I mean, very simple thing which was said as to that the per capita GDP. Is there a linear relationship between the per capita GDP and the per capita energy consumption? I really don't know whether it is that simple to assume that there is a linear relationship between the two. Can one have a higher per capita GDP with not such a strong relationship with the per capita consumption of the energy? We start working with the assumption that these things are linear. If you consume more energy, then your GDP will be more. I don't know. So that probably also needs to be looked into a more deliberated and more researched upon. So some of the very fundamental questions which probably we ignore while we start moving with certain set of assumptions. So we have to have a broader picture in the mind. We have to have an entire paradigm in front of us, and then we start moving in a particular direction.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that one actually, whether GDP really grows with energy. And I'll relate that to the condition that we are in just now, as we speak. I feel like somebody out there, thinks that I need more power right now. And frankly, I'm freezing cold. So can someone turn that off? I don't need that energy right now. And I'm freezing cold. And it's like the utility and the policy makers and so on, they say that for more GDP, we have to have this. And we're blowing this energy out somewhere. Wasting a substantial amount of it, directing it for uses that are not necessary, and not using it where it is necessary, and in the form that is not necessary. So I just wonder, I mean, the demand side has something to say. I am cold, and I don't need that. I'll leave it at that.
Over to you, Professor Tripathi, for your opening remarks.
Yeah, I think starting with what Srivastava ji said, that there is a very strong actually scientific basis behind setting this carbon zero or net zero target. And there's a whole body, I think, of people who have worked tirelessly for 3-4 decades as part of IPCC. And they worked out that if you want to either limit this rise in global temperature to 1.5 C or 2 C, accordingly you need to basically create a certain amount of carbon dioxide, which is the most important greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. And that is where the net zero concept came about and widely agreed upon. This is another issue that we definitely need to create a mass awareness amongst the people so that it really becomes more like a movement, what you are suggesting, which is a good point. But I think equally important point, which actually all along, I was not there, I had a class from 11 to 12, after that I came, was not at all, I think, alluded to was the impact of short-term or let's say mean climate change and extreme events on ecosystem, environment and humans. And that I think I would like to, because it was not mentioned, so I will just briefly touch upon that. That there are two important things which we must consider, and the center having strong interest in also climate change besides energy policy, etc., etc. That, for example, this increasing carbon dioxide, we all know, would make the oceans more acidic. And a direct consequence of that, some of you know that, bleaching of coral reef. So that is kind of an irreparable damage to a large ecosystem which houses huge amount of microorganisms, flora, fauna. That is one thing. But on the other, if you look at extreme events, for example, what we saw this year starting in March, a sudden very high increase in temperature. And that became almost like a global heat wave from March to almost up to July. I happened to be in Germany, and even Germany, part of Europe, could not escape that. And some of you know that given the shortage of grain today, wheat particularly, we are still not exporting because this sudden rise of 3 to 4 C in March led to a huge adverse impact on wheat yield in the country. So 4 or 5 states actually have recorded less than half of their average wheat production. So that brings the impact of these extreme events, which I believe we need to develop more and more capability, because they can directly, not only can make a direct impact or adverse impact on environment, you see it can impact agriculture and it can impact the people. So related to that, the other point we also did not discuss today was how do we make our environment, our ecosystem and our people more resilient? Because it is quite important that if we do not in the short term, while we are talking about 2030, 2050, who lives by 2070? So let's say even you achieve all that, but how do we make our communities more resilient so that they can adapt to climate change? And that is, I think, should also be a point of discussion. Thank you.
Absolutely, and I think very briefly Navroz tried to sort of touch upon some of those aspects, but that's okay. So I think as we're moving on to the next part of it, it's more like a moderated discussion. I would appreciate my colleague Matushi to also keep asking questions, but to start with, I got really fascinated since I'm sitting next to you, Anilji, and you worked for more than, I believe, 3 decades in the government. See, a lot of the time, even today and even yesterday, colleagues mentioned about even if you go like a BAU scenario or even a little more aggressive scenario, in terms of the pathways that we as a country are taking, there's hardly some 10 years that's left with us till we sort of achieve this 1.5 degree scenarios. So in your view, and based on your working in the past with Niti Aayog as well, do you think that the government is doing the heroic things that's needed so that this 1.5 degree scenarios will be abated in the short term? Because I would still call 10 years as a very, very short term. It's just around the corner.
Government cannot do anything. It's a very categorical statement and you must appreciate it. It's not for the government to do anything. Government has not done anything. If you are under the wrong impression that the government does something, then it's not the government which does anything. It's just that the people who have to do it, they have to do it, and only government can only facilitate it a little bit as to how we can do it. As a think tank, we can only tell the government as to what it should be doing with proper feeding of the data, information, and the modeling or results or whatever best we can do as intellectuals of the society. The issue is that the person who has to follow it has to understand, has to within 10 years of time that is going to happen, and then he has to understand it. If you tell him that, look, you follow this, you go for a solar pump. Now the solar pumps, I remember when I was SDM in Dantewada and Bijapur, which is in the Bastar district, there was a there was a solar cells. They came to my subdivision, donated by some UN agency or some international agency. I am talking about 1987. A lot of them wouldn't have been born at that time. 1987, the solar pumps came. I was sitting in my house. Some truck came. It said that there are solar pumps and you please receive them. Where are they going to be installed? I didn't have any information about it. How they are going to be installed? Who is going to install them in that tribal area in which the forest used to start within 1.5 kilometers of my home. So there, and then it was to be, I said, okay, then just keep it and put it in front of my house or somewhere, and then it just kept lying there. So that is what is something, and if you go and tell the villager as to this is the solar pump and those 1987, he will say, what for? So the adoption, and now if you go to a village, now I'm talking a scenario which is after 40 years. If you go and talk to any villager now, he is more than eager to follow and have the solar cell and have his solar water pump. Now this is the change which has taken place. This change took place maybe about 10-15 years back when I was in Jabalpur and the villages I used to see. There now the acceptability has come. So it is a question of that how fast we can make him realize as to this is in your interest, this is in the interest of the society, and this is how we should proceed. Now, I'll give another example. In 1987, 88, we used to have the people forcibly taken for their sterilization and the family planning camps, and they used to follow the sterilization only because they used to get 250 or 350 odd rupees during those days. Now you talk today, everybody is following family planning, they are having 2 children. So this is for them to realize as to what is in their interest, what is our role sitting here in those academic institutions and these intellectual places and things, that how do we make it, them understand those who have to follow it.
Sure, so I think the kind of sense which I'm making out of this, and I think this is to you, Amitabh, since you come from the media background and not just like climate change, you covered, I believe, other sets as well. So what is this role of, we keep hearing about this mass movement, like these campaigns, and you've covered a lot of these campaigns, like both at the international level as well as locally. Do you think that these campaigns are really making the kind of difference that is needed today? Or do you think something more is needed which is kind of missing?
No, I think the awareness levels are already high. I lots of people. Nobody would be unaware of the kind of impacts that climate change is happening. People are experiencing it firsthand, so there's nothing to be, people don't need to be that much aware of. Yeah. The thing is when technology dispersion would happen if people inherently find benefits in using the technology. Right, so nobody actually made us aware of the technology of mobile phones. Why don't you start using it? It's a very beneficial technology. We started using it because we found the benefits, we found other people using it, and we felt the need for it. And it would happen with most of the other technologies as well. Some of them would be contributing in our climate goals. So once those kind of technologies are available for the farmer, you will see the whole idea of air pollution, coming in from Punjab because of the parali burning. If there is a technology that was available that could be deployed at a cheaper rate for farmers, and if the farmers did find some benefit in using that, it would have been taken care of by now. It's just that, you know, that kind of technology probably is not available. So whatever kind of convincing that you try to do with the farmers, you will always have some of them sneaking at some area and trying to burn their farms. Still, they find something that would be of benefit to them.
Got it. And now over to you.
I'll just add to this Parali wording. For 3 years, I've been in the committee of the Prime Minister, which looks into it as to how to avoid Delhi's pollution. And since we have not been able to give this thing and the kind of the federal structure and the governance structure that the country has, we cannot force upon something even to the farmers, those who are burning their stubbles. So you see, I mean, this is just not possible unless he realizes that it is in his interest to do that.
Yeah, so just taking a cue from there. I mean, you can't really force anybody, and you know, this made me come to you back, you know, Swapnil. So nobody really even asked Infosys or forced you guys to do anything in back like 10, 11 years ago. But you volunteered yourself. Infosys volunteered themselves and sort of took a pledge to go maybe carbon neutral by 2020 or something. Correct me if I'm wrong. So what made you do that? I mean, no government was asking you to do anything, but you know, what was the real incentive for it? Was it like some cost-benefit analysis you guys did, or what is it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, cost was definitely one of the motivators for us, and primarily it was also the vision that our founders had, right? We realized that as we were growing, you know, and as we were scaling up, it was important for us to focus on aspects that impacted us, right? We were operating, I mean, we were growing 30% a year. When we are growing 30% a year, it means that we need to have more resources around energy, water, and waste. And we've spoken a lot about strategy, we've spoken a lot about policy, and I've been kind of, for the lack of better words, itching to you know, put across a framework that we have followed for the past 10 years to be a carbon neutral company. Right? And I brought in elements of what I call as practical sustainability to the discussion here. And when I talk about sustainability, right, it is so important for all of us to have a 360-degree view of what sustainability is. And when we have a 360-degree view, we need to essentially look at data, information that comes in for us to be able to make decisions. We need to look at the technology that exists today, or technology that is being developed, or technology that can be implemented and scaled up. We need to look at the cultural aspects of it, ensure that the farmers should realize that stubble burning is not indeed the right thing to do. And then we also need to look at the financial aspect of it. So 4 critical elements that contribute to the 360-degree view for sustainability are data, technology, financials, and of course culture. The implementation methodology, the pathways are very simple. And I'll take built environment, or buildings as one of a classic example here. And if I exceed my time, please stop me.
No, sure.
Right? So if you just look at the buildings, right? Buildings account for close to 40% of the total GHG emissions. Buildings have 2 components of carbon, right? Embodied carbon and operational carbon. Operational carbon is around 29%, embodied carbon is about 11%. Forget the embodied carbon at this point in time, let's just look at operational carbon. When I'm talking about operational carbon in the built environment, that focuses on 40% of the total GHG emissions, and I need to focus only on the operational aspects of the building, such that I focus 29% of the 40% of the GHG emissions. What do? I look at initial use cases, and these use cases are energy, water, because it's an important resource, waste, and then all the other emissions that make up for whichever category they fall in, right? Scope 1, 2, and 3. When I look at energy, for old buildings that already exist, I start putting in retrofits, start making in interventions where the energy consumption, energy use is reduced. I do it either by replacing old air handling units or air conditioning units, or I look at managing the air conditioning equipment effectively so that energy is safe. Right? This is one aspect. Strategies such as designing, orienting your buildings right, putting in lighting shelves so that there's a lot of daylight that comes in. Essentially, all contribute to reducing these energy consumption, right? So that's one aspect of it. Then start putting in renewable energy, right? So that your dependence on the fossil fuel go, and it all impacts your carbon footprint, right? So then look at water. Look at end-use consumption strategies, design your water systems right. Look at waste, ensure that you have your reduce, recycle and reuse aspects, the circularity aspects in place. Look at the ways from moving from linear to circular frameworks that we've been talking about. And when you identify these initial use cases, and then when you look at what I call as sustainability megatrends, all practical sustainability aspects, where you're designing the building right, you're designing the water system right, reducing the waste, you're being responsible over a time period, and then mapping the overall impact on a year that or on a benchmark, right, for similar built environment scenarios. You are in a position to actually achieve results that are phenomenal, right? And all of these frameworks that I just spoke about, and I was not able to kind of really speak about it in as comprehensive way as I would want it to be. But when we put in this data and when we looked at and when we captured all of this, the composite improvement in sustainability metrics, just focusing on 4 use cases on a scale of what I call a sustainability megatrends on the year starting 2008 to 2020, the composite improvement across all of these has been to the tune of 62%. And we have data that proves, year-on-year data that proves energy reduction, across the built environment. Again, I shared it in the presentation yesterday. Our headcount grew 166% since 2008. The overall energy consumption went up just 19%, right? So when we grew 166%, it meant that our real estate also grew 166%. I have saved 30 megawatt worth of connected load, or reduced 30 megawatt worth of connected load across Infosys campuses in 4 years.
So I think that's quite fascinating. Thanks, Swapnil, for that. I mean, I would in fact say that, when these cities like Kanpur and all, when they talk about the, 2047 pathways at the city level, a lot of the things that you've done and designing your templates, I think would be sort of referred off and on. I mean, since you're talking about the demand side, let me just quickly get to Nitin.
We also have a co-moderator who wanted to step in.
Just give me 2 minutes, because there is just one question, and then over to you, Maushami, and pardon me for that. Because it's really sort of struggling me, because ever since Nitin mentioned that, the reduction of load is not really the incentive of a DISCOM, right? So that's really sort of an intriguing argument, and you're absolutely right? There is no incentive built in for any DISCOM to reduce the load at the other end. So what is sort of really heroic that you think is needed so that A, the incentives are to be built, or maybe should DISCOM behave like the way these transcoms or transmitting companies are doing? They're working like just highways, right? They only charge 4 paisa unit and just give you the freeway or whatever, the driveway there. So do you think that is the future that is needed, and grid connectivity is the real issue, and let's just get out of it?
So what is the heroic thing that needs to be done, right? I mean, I guess one of the things that I would look at, there could be several examples, but let me pick on one that I spoke about earlier, let's say, agricultural load. It's responsible for about 15 to 18% of our GHG emissions. These are customers that you don't want. And the utilities are complaining all the time that they have to give them free power and all this, and they have to cross-subsidize it. It is in their commercial interest to let go of these customers and to allow mini-grids, microgrids, and off-grid options to be built for them. So actually not too heroic, but a simple thing would be that rather than counting the number of connections that they have to give on their grid, if these other microgrid and off-grid options are counted as a part of this, and that in fact these unprofitable customers are let go, and that the utilities actually encourage them to be serviced by someone else, including themselves, who can actually do it better. I would also urge that the C&I sector, the commercial and industrial sector, actually take an active participation in this, whether it's through their CSR or investments, because it is in their benefit, because they will have to cross-subsidize less. So this is a simple, actually quite non-heroic, straight business school solution. But to do it would be heroic. And I would say that that would be the heroic thing to do.
Thank you. Over to you, Mosmi.
Yeah, I am not taking much of the audience time, but okay, so one just question for Shirish and then one for Amitabh, and I'll let the floor open for the audience. So, Shirish, everybody kind of agrees that climate change is very, crucial. We need funds for that transition to happen. And yet, in reality, we do not find the funds flowing in. So where are we stuck, especially from India? Like, what is that needs to change to make that, finance flow?
But from the perspective that we see it, funds or money for action on different set of transition that needs to happen, not just climate, but there are other sectoral transition that needs required. Global institutions have those funds, but those funds are not unlocked. If you look at the what we call it as a lazy capital is sitting with most of the financial institutions. What is needed is to bring reforms in the Bretton Woods institutions where most of these, the way the systems are designed, are not essentially allowing. Multilateral banks are sitting on resources which are not getting properly deployed or the rightly deployed. And then obviously, so we keep going, and Amitabh was talking about in his earlier address today about the financial commitments the countries, developed countries have made. None of it has been unlocked sufficiently. A lot of it is getting converted into ODA-related grant, which this was supposed to be over and above the ODA. Right? But I don't think any of this is essentially going to flow so easily unless some of the reforms that are really needed to unlock those lazy capital that's basically. So I think that's there. I think there's enough wealth in the private sector, the private capital market, there's enough wealth in the public finance system. It's just that the way they've been designed, these are not currently providing us the resources that we need.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So maybe my final question is, Amitabh, to you. You have been part and you have observed these climate negotiations as part of COP various meetings. UNFCCC Executive Secretary Patricia Esponisia mentioned that the level of trust is what is driving these climate negotiations between countries. After whatever has happened between Russia and Ukraine and where the energy prices are now, have you seen in your career this trust actually getting becoming a big factor in climate negotiations? Not now, but even before that. And how do you think it will shape the
You mean the lack of trust, is it?
Yeah, correct.
Oh, there's a huge lack of trust at most of these meetings. So that's what I mean. There are interest groups. And there are competing interest groups, and that's why countries negotiate as part of a group, not individually. So they get into the groups, and there is a huge sort of mistrust in between groups. Also, the way the problem is framed, and the way this entire climate change negotiation framework happens. There is ample amount of opportunity for mistrust to grow, you know, developed versus developing, rich versus poor, resource rich versus resource poor, all kinds of battles keep on happening. So one sort of mistrust is very latent mistrust because of, because of very obvious reasons. They are already there. The other mistrust grows, comes to the fore out of problems in procedure, the way negotiations get handled sometimes, and that gives rise to mistrust often. Not everyone is given a proper hearing at a meeting, for example. Climate change negotiations happen by consensus, right? And when so some countries come with large delegations, and these are like countries, big countries would have large delegations. Smaller countries would have 2 or 3 representatives coming in, and very often they don't get to speak individually. There are like 50 or 80 or 100 meetings happening simultaneously, and you can't possibly attend each one of them. Countries also can't possibly attend each one of them. And even though important ones that they want to attend, very often, because there are 194 countries, not everyone gets to speak, but at least the group voices get heard. But very often, the negotiations are conducted in a manner that certain groups feel alienated or marginalized. And again, that's also very often is an issue of mistrust that comes up. And you also would like to see that lots of times negotiations are conducted in a manner that is not very transparent, and secret documents are being floated and those kind of. That has got reduced to a very large extent now. But in some of the earlier meetings, there are lots of these things used to happen, which gives rise to mistrust.
I have one final question for you. How big is the misinformation around climate change in Indian media?
I think in the Indian media, there's not too much of a problem. Climate denialism, I don't see it happening in Indian media that much. Not much. It's also because of, there isn't enough climate reporting happening in India. Also, even to be denying climate change, you have to have certain amount of capacity to understand the entire process and then deny it. So that is seriously lacking. But so that at least the denialism part is not a problem that I see in India. It's happening. But even at the international level, there might be, it's an irritant, but I don't think it's a major issue. You can't stop some people from, there are flat earthers, very strong flat earther organizations still, so let them exist, it's fine.
So with this, we will open the floor to the audience, please. Please feel free to ask your questions.
Yeah, or you have any comments, suggestion, idea, more than welcome.
So you said that we cannot force someone for that struggle burning thing. But if we have alternatives for it, then why not create a law for it or something like that, which stop them from burning it? If it is benefiting in the national interest, then what is the problem?
No, what you are saying is absolutely correct. The government can make the policies, they can have the various instruments to direct the public behavior or the conduct in a particular direction. Now then, this is our job, this is the job of the think tank advisors to advise the government to come out with those kind of directions or the policies which direct the behavior in a certain direction. But the constraints are the political system, the federal structure that we have. The Punjab is ruled by another party which is in loggerheads with the government, central government in Delhi, and all those issues are there. So these are the things, but yes, of course, the government can have the policies which will certainly can lead to a behavior in certain directions so that the stubble burning is stopped. I'll give an example. Now recently the government has come out with production linked incentive schemes. And also we had promoted the dynamic taxation regime for the government. For the first time the finance ministry started thinking along those lines. What happens in other countries, particularly our strong neighbor China, that the moment they see that something is to be exported or imported, they keep on changing their duty structures. So now in the government, Indian government should also think about the changing the dynamic duty regime or dynamic taxation regime, so that we can direct the behavior or the movement of resources in a certain direction. So similarly, as you said, the stubble burning can be done, and we need to have policies, and then there are issues related. बेटा सामने रख जाओ, आप छोड़ दीजिए, और नहीं चाहिए बोतल, ले जाइए, उधर रख दीजिए किनारे, ले जाइए बता, प्लीज. So I was giving you an example that was related to the dynamic taxation and the dynamic duty regime. So the production-linked incentive schemes which have been now introduced during the last 2-3 years, they have tremendous potential for improving or enhancing our manufacturing capabilities. Now these are the issues which the government comes out with that. But then you can also think that why is it that we didn't do it for the last 50 years? Why did it that we are always looking at the China or the northeast or the eastern neighbors, Korea, Japan or Taiwan, for importing our things? I mean, look at this pen would also probably made in China and things like that. That's why I asked the question that why is it we can't make sensors in the country? So these are all issues, very complicated issues, but yes, I agree with you. Government can make the policies, can direct, can make the policies, or can make an ecosystem in which the behavior or the conduct is directed in a particular direction.
Yeah, there's one more hand there, and just to sort of add very quickly there on this point of stubble burning, I think the government today is not the government what it used to be like a decade or 2 decades back, right? I mean, this government is more about building incentives into this innovation technologies around. So I think that's one of the way government is looking at solving the problem of stubble. But yeah.
Sir, I have a question. As you mentioned, like the realization part of a particular person, so that means he or she should realize that we have to switch to renewable or renewable sources of energy. But sir, if you think about a particular village family who is just surviving, sir, why they would think like, if instead of taking gas cylinder for a particular X amount, I can take wood which is available in forest for free. So why would they think about environment if they are not, means they are just able to survive themselves? So what can people do to realize? Is it education or increasing their income or any particular cause?
So I think this is to you, maybe SMT. I mean, so I think what I'm sensing, and correct me if I'm wrong, so there are a lot of these costs as well, not just the cost to the LPG cylinder, cost to cheaper or free wood, but there is also a cost to health. See, if a woman in a smaller poor household is using wood as a cooking option, I mean, obviously the health will get deteriorated. Is there any way you're capturing it? Or, I mean, how do you see this conundrum, right? I mean, on one hand, you want to sort of avoid the cheaper or sort of a poorer family to use expensive fuels, but on the other hand, you need to also see whether they are healthy and they're okay.
No, the cost to health is very clear, you know, of using LPG, and in fact, there was a very clear, I think, also a dimension of gender dimension there, that rural women were more impacted by, using this solid fuel and other thing. But despite, I think, 14 crore or whatever LPG cylinders were rolled out in the first phase, and we have seen actually as Vaibhav, because that's why I think it directed me, we looked into the overall, positive health impact of these, and that was substantial. But people did not continue. I mean, good number, I think probably Anilji will know that good number did not sustain, again, primarily because of economic as well as some way behavioral considerations, that some people still feel that cooking on solid fuel is leads to better food, which is quite surprising. But more importantly, I think it is a cost. So that is where I believe, that's why I think government has started what they call LPG.
Ujjwala.
Ujjwala is of course there. They have, like ASHA workers, they have created a whole product, LPG Mitra or Ujjwala Mitra, just to convince people so that they can continue. I am no economist. I think there are more qualified people to.
But just only lighter. But just only lighter.
But the health benefits. Yeah. if it can be disseminated to people in a much better way, I think that is the only way what I see. Right?
Yeah, I mean, right to clean air, right to clean water, I mean, these are the rights which we oftentimes sort of, say is like the right to life, so don't you think that also right to food and hence cooking and all could be like qualified as the right to living, and hence there has to be massive subsidized.
The right to food doesn't arise, they have food.
Yeah.
It's what they cook.
Yeah.
Right to clean fuel.
Clean fuel, yeah.
I don't know, I mean, how we can implement that.
Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, which provides free gas cylinder, smaller free gas cylinder to the rural poor or the poor. It has not succeeded the way it should have succeeded. The people take the first cylinder, it just keeps lying there, and then they revert back to the. We got an evaluation of the scheme done from the Niti Aayog. It's about 40% people and the 60% went back to the fuel goods.
Yeah.
So this is what is that person has to realize that her or his health is at stake. That is something just again and again trying to.
I have just comment on that. Because I am connected to some private communities, and I see the problem of not succeeding that is not that they are not aware of health. So when government gave the cylinder, they were using it because the ladies were really happy with that. But now a person who is earning a house which is earning 2,000 to 5,000 rupees per month, when the price is increased, they could not afford it. So they directly told us, sir, how do we afford it? Okay, so that is the issue has to be solved, because prices may be increased for others, but for them there should be subsidy.
The cost benefit analysis for them.
So but government can still give them subsidies only to them those who are needy.
There is, but it is not sufficient.
So you had a follow-up, I believe. Yeah?
No, sir, second question different to Sinha, sir. You mentioned about the Kyoto Protocol. To you, Kyoto Protocol, and then we move to the Paris Agreement. Sir, now there was no anything rules or baseline, just it was considered. But now if we see, like India, it is 1/5 of the population, or if we even look at China, which handles most of the manufacturing of the world. So is there any discussion going on in between the countries, like because I am 1/5 of the population, I should get some more of the carbon budget which is allocated to everyone? Or China can argue that because I am handling most of the manufacturing of the world, I should get more amount of like sitting space or more relaxation in the amount of tons of carbon dioxide I am handling.
But the budget has to be available. No, there is no budget available.
So like, instead if we consider the total amount, China can say that give me some more instead of some.
So in the morning, I think Navroze's presentation or somebody else made the point. The available carbon budget is only about 220 gigaton for 1.5 degree target, which means roughly 4.5 years. 4.5 years. We in terms of GHG, I think we are doing 47 gigatons every year. Then it's about 4.5 years, maximum 5 years of carbon budget available. And India and China, if that is the criteria that has to be used, 1/5 of humanity and also whatever percentage of global production that has been happening in China, then these two countries would probably occupy 80% of the entire carbon budget. What happens to others? So, in fact, the carbon budget formula is only one way to look at it, and not many people are very convinced with the carbon budget. In fact, it had become outdated at some point of time. In between, nobody used to talk about carbon budget, but with this new, with this 1.5 degree thing becoming much more prominent in the last couple of years, this carbon budget conversation has restarted all over again. And if you look at from the budget angle, then obviously there isn't much budget left, for the entire world.
Hello, sir. The question that Mosnia asked me about the lack of trust between the countries when the negotiations happen is precisely because of that, right? The developing countries, India, China, basically the whole basic group, always use that we need the carbon budget space to grow. And now because our per capita emission traditionally has been lower, whereas compared to others. So that level discussion is a basis of mistrust also. And then there are certain commitments which the other countries, developed countries had to fulfill. have not been fulfilled. So that conversation keeps happening. Sorry.
Sir, as we have compartmentalization at international level, as we have developed countries, developing country, underdeveloped country, then why can't we have compartmentalization at regional level? As we know that poor people have less emission and rich people have higher emission. So and their awareness also depends from like we can compartmentalization जो हम लोग बात समझ सकते हैं वो आप किसी गांव वाले इंसान को तो नहीं समझा सकते, राइट? तो फिर there should be a compartmentalization. Then why can't we have this compartmentalization at regional level?
So I think let me just decode that a little more. I think that's a very interesting question. So I think the question is that we keep hearing and talking about developed world versus developing world. Even within India, there is a whole developed states versus developing states. Even within the states, there are categories of super low-lying EWS vis-à-vis the very rich people on the other hand, right? So how are we looking at even within the country to see some kind of a game-changer policy wherein few things could be given to those who are barely emitting and maybe some punitive action to those 1 or 2 or 5% who are like extraordinarily emitting? You know, why are we not thinking on those lines? Or if at all we'll be thinking on those lines? Maybe if Nathan you would like to take it, yeah?
Sure. I mean, the short answer is yes, it should be. Yeah, absolutely.
Just like as we have currency, we like analyze energy as currency. So as we have taxes for income tax, then why can't we have like compartmentalization on the basis of amount of load we are using, or like electricity we are using, or energy we are using?
No, I mean there's no question that there is an inbuilt inequity as to who carries the burden. In fact, if you take the carbon budget that, let's say, India has used up so far within that overall global carbon budget, then quite a bit of that budget has been used up by those, probably the wealthier class, because they have used most of the energy. Whatever remaining budget we think we have, out of that, most of that, is something that the poorer sections have not had the opportunity to use, and to expect them to, and in fact, further to your point, whatever remaining budget we have, if we don't do what you say we need to do, and we say that we all carry the burden, then in that limited budget, imagine how much more constrained the poor will be. So as compared to, so I think it's a very poignant point. It's a very good point, and I absolutely support it.
Totally, and I think this is such a fascinating discussion. This can go on and on and on. So I'm really conscious of everybody's time here and the panel. But yeah, in case any. Yeah.
So she has just a quick follow-up. What should we do? That's what she's saying.
Yes, sir.
Right, and so I mean I'm thinking offhand here. I would say off the cuff, but I don't have any cuffs. So, but as a quick thought on this, people have sort of imagined different ways of imposing carbon tax for the remaining budget, right? So I'm thinking aloud now. So maybe since you're comparing that with that global scheme with sort of a regional scheme, maybe there is something that we can think about where that tax burden, the carbon tax burden, is levied more on the richer class than, or the more consumptive class, let's put it that way, than it would be on the less consumptive class.
Yeah. Thankfully, there is no richer class sitting here on the stage, otherwise they might be different argument. But let's just hear one last comment from
So just one small point. The point that you are making on that distinction to be made within the country as well. That distinction exists. At least a discussion on that has been there, and it was made as a sort of bargaining argument that India put forward vis-à-vis other countries, and that is the distinction between lifestyle emissions versus survival emissions. Right. So that was the bargaining sort of an argument that India put forward for the other countries. Look, most of our emissions are actually survival emissions, and your emissions, your means Western countries' emissions, are sort of lifestyle emissions. So it's more important to reduce your emissions versus reducing our emissions. Now that argument can be flipped inward as well, and exactly for the purpose that you are making, and say even within the country there is a large population, and that distinction can be made between lifestyle emissions and survival emissions, and then accordingly some sort of a taxation program or whatever can be introduced. It's a difficult thing to implement. It's a good bargaining argument.
So one final comment from Shirish, and then we are closing the session.
Just to quickly react to, and very valid point that you said, and building on what Amitabh was saying. In fact, I was talking about the subnational engagement that we're talking about. Our approach has been that we're focusing on two states, Maharashtra and Uttar Pradesh. And we're saying Maharashtra is more industrialized, urbanized state. Therefore, it needs to decarbonize faster compared to UP, where the economy currently is still largely rural, right? And therefore, it needs that space to grow and therefore reach it. So, and I think that's the sort of conversation that has started to happen. In our discussion with the state government in Maharashtra, they realize that they need to do much faster, and also, right? And I think this is where I think the reason I was focusing more on the implementation side is the public finance which is available through the various schemes of the program, if they can be directed, it can start addressing the issues of inequity that exists currently, which you are basically raising. And that's where the direction of implementation goes.
Absolutely. And this brings us to the end of the session, and we have a lot of action points and follow-ups to take from this whole discussion that we've had. A big round of applause for all the panelists here, and thank you for